Welcome back. We are jumping immediately into territory that really defines the eternal architecture of human thought.
It absolutely does.
Today, we're wrestling with a concept that fundamentally limits and defines how we view the universe and our place in it.
And that concept is chance.
Exactly. We're exploring this through the rigorous, exhaustive lens of Mortimer Adler's Syntopicon essay on this very idea.
And before we immerse ourselves in what is an exceptionally complex philosophical analysis, it's important for you to know what's driving this conversation.
Right. This is a little different.
You are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM. And it's designed specifically for this kind of deeper, more dynamic essay analysis.
What that means for us and for you is that this technology lets us synthesize material that spans thousands of years of intellectual history, really pulling out the core arguments and the intricate web of connections that truly matter.
It's about getting to the heart of the debate, fast.
That's right. Our mission today isn't just to summarize. It's to give you a kind of high-speed, comprehensive shortcut to understanding centuries of intellectual debate.
Because the essay treats chance not as everyday luck, not just a coin flip.
No, not at all.
But as a great idea that establishes the very boundary of order in the cosmos.
It is, by definition, the limit of predictability. We're exploring why confronting this limit is maybe the most pivotal intellectual act in Western thought.
I think that's fair to say. If you really want to be well-informed about the foundational arguments of Western civilization, theological, scientific, ethical, you have to understand the rigorous role chance plays.
It's the spoiler.
It is. It's the concept that forces every major system of thought, whether it's built by scientists or theologians or philosophers, to confront the limits of its own certainty.
It's where human reason meets the unexpected.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's really unpack the weight of that claim. Why is chance a great idea and not just, say, a side effect of other ideas like cause or fate?
Well, the first and maybe the most revealing piece of information in Adler's framework is just the placement of the idea itself.
Where it sits on the map, so to speak.
Precisely. It's not treated as some marginal notion tucked away in an appendix. It's listed right there in volume number I of the Syntopicon alongside these monumental foundational concepts.
Like what?
Like cause, change, fate, and necessity and contingency.
So its geographical position in the intellectual map signals its importance. It means you can't really talk about cause and effect without immediately having to address the possibility of the uncaused effect.
Its placement is absolutely crucial. When an idea is clustered with those foundational metaphysical and scientific concepts, it signals that chance is a primary lens through which Western thinkers have tried to understand reality itself.
So it forces a definition.
It forces us to define what we mean by intelligibly ordered. An ordered universe is one that operates according to predictable laws, right? Laws that human reason can, at least in theory, decipher.
And chance is the immediate, ever-present challenge to that entire project.
It is.
That's where we get to the core definition presented in the essay. Chance marks the division between what is intelligibly ordered and what appears contingent, accidental, or unplanned.
In both human life and the natural world.
Right.
That boundary is the core intellectual problem Adler is highlighting, and it's a fundamental problem of reconciliation.
What do you mean by reconciliation?
The central challenge is asking, how do we reconcile apparent randomness, the seemingly uncaused, unexpected event, with the deep-seated human desire for an ordered cosmos?
Whether that order is divine or mechanistic, we want things to make sense.
We do. And this challenge is existential for philosophy and for science. Western thought, particularly since the Greeks, has been characterized by this rigorous search for universal laws and principles.
And chance is the disruption.
It is the disruption of that search. And that disruption forces these critical questions about predictability and causation.
Okay, let's use an example.
Let's take the classic one. A pedestrian is delayed waiting for a bus, and because of that delay, he misses being hit by a falling piece of debris from a building.
A lucky break. An accident.
But was his survival truly an accident? Or was it the determined, necessary result of incredibly complex forces? The timing of the bus, a slight shift in atmospheric pressure, the specific decay rate of the structural material.
Yeah.
All of it entirely determined, but just too complex for any human or even a machine to perfectly track.
So if we take the extreme deterministic view, the kind championed by philosophers like Spinoza, then that whole sequence of events, no matter how chaotic it seems to us, wasn't an accident at all.
Not in the slightest. It was inevitable.
The man's survival was necessary, Chance, in that view, is just the name we give to our limited perspective.
Our human ignorance of the true infinite complexity of causes.
Right.
And that is the pivotal point the Syntopicon urges us to consider. Chance functions as this pivot in long-running debates about causality, freedom, providence, scientific explanation.
Because if the universe is perfectly knowable and predictable, even in principle, then chance as a separate, potent entity vanishes.
It just becomes a statistical artifact of limited data.
But the stakes here are huge. If every event, no matter how unexpected, is theoretically predictable, if we had infinite data, then order is absolute.
The universe is a clockwork mechanism.
And we are merely cogs within it.
Exactly. But the opposing view is equally powerful. What if chance is truly real? What if there are genuinely contingent events where causal chains intersect without any internal necessity?
Without a pre-existing connection.
Yes. If true contingency exists, that fundamentally breaks the absolute causal chain. And that opens the door to genuine novelty, genuine accident, and genuine unpredictability in the very structure of reality.
And Adler's project maps the intellectual battles fought by thinkers on either side of that line.
The realm of necessity versus the realm of contingency. That's the conflict.
It's a profound, almost dizzying thought experiment that has to come before every single scientific or theological discussion about the cosmos. Where does the certainty end, and where does the potential chaos begin?
That's what we're defining when we define chance.
So to really understand where this distinction solidified in Western thought, you're saying we have to go back.
We must go back to the ancient world, specifically to Aristotle. He really provided the foundational framework that subsequent generations either accepted, rejected, or tried to refine.
And the core of his view rests on a key distinction in the natural world. He divides all events into two fundamental categories.
The first category covers events that happen for the most part. These are events that occur regularly, according to nature or purpose, the predictable operation of final causes.
A heavy object falls downward. A specific type of seed grows into a specific type of tree.
Right. These events follow discernible, expected patterns. They are, in a sense, necessary components of the natural order.
And the second category, the exception to the rule, is made up of events that occur by chance.
Aristotle's example, which the essay details, is very illustrative. Imagine a man is digging a foundation for a house. The purpose, the final cause of his labor, is to prepare the ground for construction.
Makes sense.
Now, if during that digging, he happens upon a forgotten cache of gold coins, well, the gold was not the purpose of the digging.
And the digging wasn't the intended way to find the gold.
Exactly. The finding of the treasure is a result of chance. It's an accidental confluence. The meeting of the digger's determined action with the determined but completely unrelated resting place of the gold.
This distinction is crucial because it allows Aristotle to say that the universe is mostly ordered and purposeful, but still allows for genuine contingency.
Yes, the finding of the gold was not something that happened for the most part of that man's activity.
The profound implication, then, is that Aristotle is trying to preserve a sphere of genuine contingency without sacrificing the overarching order of the universe.
He recognized that there are multiple chains of causation running in parallel, the man's digging, the history of the gold's burial, and sometimes they just intersect without the intention or necessity of either chain dictating that meeting.
And that unplanned intersection, for Aristotle, is the definition of chance.
It is. And it creates the original philosophical axis of conflict. Is this intersection just a product of our ignorance, or is it a real break in absolute necessity?
So for a strict determinist like the Stoics, or later Spinoza, that treasure was placed there by a necessary sequence of causes stretching all the way back to the beginning of time.
And the man's digging was also necessary. The intersection, while it was surprising to the man, was an entirely necessary event. If you accept that, then Aristotle's definition of chance just collapses back into human ignorance.
But for Aristotle, by preserving genuine chance, he avoids making every single event a matter of absolute necessity.
Which then allows for a larger discussion of human action and freedom later on.
We should also acknowledge the historical depth here. I mean, even before Aristotle, there was the concept of the Clinamen.
That's an excellent point to bring in for context. The concept of the Clinamen, or the swerve, which was introduced by Epicurus, is actually even more radical than Aristotle's view.
Epicurus was an atomist, right? So he believed all reality was just atoms moving in a void.
Exactly. And if all atoms simply moved downward in straight lines, the universe would be a boring, non-interacting cascade, and all motion would be strictly necessary.
So what was his solution to introduce chance into that system?
He posited that At entirely random and unpredictable moments, an atom would spontaneously swerve just slightly off its path. This tiny, uncaused accidental motion of the Kleinemann was necessary for atoms to collide and form compounds.
And most importantly,
he posited it as the fundamental physical source of human free will. This is a very early, very radical philosophical embrace of true, inherent randomness. It's far removed from the idea of just being ignorant of the causes.
So even in the ancient world, we see the full spectrum that's mapped by the Syntopicon.
You have it all, from absolute determinism where everything is necessary,
To moderate contingency, like Aristotle, where chance is an accidental intersection.
to radical contingency like Epicurus, where chance is the fundamental structure of motion itself.
And the Syntopicon uses Aristotle's distinction, that line between for the most part and by chance, as the intellectual anchor, the original dividing line that frames every single debate that follows.
It does. Whether you are a medieval theologian discussing secondary causes or a modern physicist discussing quantum fields, you are fundamentally answering the challenge posed by Aristotle's accidental man finding gold.
It provides the intellectual vocabulary for the entire conversation. It's pretty remarkable how a single, carefully defined philosophical move from millennia ago continues to define the deepest questions of modern science.
It really is.
And this takes us right back to the question of measurement. If we can't fully trust our senses to determine if an event is necessary or contingent, what happens when we try to measure randomness itself?
Well, that's the massive intellectual shift that happens in the modern era.
The shift is tectonic.
Absolutely. Classical philosophers dealt with chance qualitatively, the surprising event, the unexpected outcome. But starting roughly in the 17th century, thinkers began to seek a quantitative measure,
This is when chance becomes directly tied to rigorous mathematical modeling.
specifically probability and statistics.
And this is when chance moves out of the philosopher's study and into the mathematician's laboratory. It really starts with analyzing games of chance, like dice throws, driven by figures like Pascal and Fermat.
Yes, the birth of probability theory. This allowed the concept of chance to stretch dramatically. It transformed from the simple philosophical dilemma of everyday luck into a highly complex, measurable randomness.
So instead of just asking, did this happen by chance, we could now rigorously ask, what is the precise probability that this happened based on the known, necessary constraints?
This changes the entire framing. Chance is no longer a purely metaphysical problem, an argument about the ultimate structure of reality, but it's also a calculation problem.
We can now quantify risk, predict demographic shifts, and organize entire industries around the mathematical expectation of randomness.
And this mathematical approach enabled new, vital fields, actuarial science, insurance, genetics, statistical mechanics. It's the practical application of randomness.
Yet, even as we model it precisely, the fundamental philosophical debate persists, just lurking beneath the surface of the statistics.
That's the key. When we calculate a 50% probability, are we describing the inevitable outcome of necessary causes we simply haven't tracked? Or are we describing the precise mathematical measure of inherent randomness that truly exists in the world?
The math works either way.
The math works either way, but the metaphysical understanding shifts entirely.
That distinction between mathematically mapping ignorance versus mathematically mapping inherent reality is what makes this topic so fertile for philosophical disagreement even today.
A statistician models the data. A philosopher interprets what that data means about the universe.
And that ongoing need for interpretation and rational reflection brings us to a useful moment to pause.
It does. For those of you who enjoy having these complex essays broken down and synthesized into accessible understanding, I do want to mention our YouTube channel, Mindful Moments.
It's a great resource.
It offers AI essay analysis, summaries, and critiques, really inspiring reflection and rational thought on dense concepts just like these. We aim to take complex philosophical material and make it digestible, so you can engage rationally with these big ideas.
That pursuit of rational thought is definitely needed when we move into the truly modern scientific frontier, quantum theory. This is where the idea of chance is forced into the very structure of nature itself, in a way that challenges every classical assumption.
Indeed. The Syntopicon is designed to map the entire evolution of this great idea of chance, and that mapping cannot avoid the radical redefinition imposed by 20th century physics.
And this is where the philosophical ground shifts entirely. In classical Newtonian physics, the assumption was always absolute determinism.
Right. Given the initial conditions, the entire future state of the universe is necessary and predictable.
If something seemed random, it was our fault for not having enough information.
But in quantum mechanics, as the essay notes, randomness is integrated not as a lack of knowledge, but potentially as a fundamental property of reality itself.
The behavior of subatomic particles, their position, their momentum, can't be determined with certainty.
Only with probability. The famous Heisenberg uncertainty principle suggests there are inherent limits to what can be known simultaneously, not because of faulty instruments, but because of the intrinsic nature of the particle.
So the probabilistic nature of particle behavior fundamentally challenges that classical view that underlying determinism must exist.
The mathematical models of probability are no longer just tools for coping with our ignorance.
They might be the only language available to describe the universe at its most basic level.
And this moves the concept of chance entirely out of the realm of human perception and places it squarely into the objective structure of nature.
If the universe, at its most basic level, operates on probabilities rather than certainties, then chance is not merely an accident of human affairs.
But a necessary structural component of physical reality. This is a profound break from the Aristotelian starting point.
It is, in essence, the scientific vindication of Epicurus's ancient Kleinemen, but now it's formalized and measured.
A perfect way to put it. We are no longer talking about the accidental intersection of two determined chains, like in Aristotle's example.
We're talking about a system where the chains themselves are fundamentally indeterminate until they're observed.
That is the complete inversion of the ancient argument. The ancient debate was about whether apparent chance hides real necessity.
And the quantum view suggests that the apparent necessity we see in the macroscopic world, a billiard ball following a predictable path, might hide real chance at the subatomic level.
And Adler's essay shows how this single great idea absorbs and maps that wide fundamental range, from the philosophical question of whether chance exists to the scientific question of how we model its effects.
And whether those models reflect a true underlying randomness. The journey from a man accidentally finding gold to a quantum particle appearing in two places at once is quite the intellectual stretch.
It certainly is. But the underlying tension, that battle between necessity and contingency, remains the driving force.
Now we come to the so what section of the essay.
Yes, the true power of the Syntopicon is how it structurally forces these complex ideas to interact.
The material emphasizes that chance's proximity in volume number I to cause, fate, necessity, and contingency is highly significant. This isn't just a physical location in a book.
No, it's a conceptual constraint. It creates a necessary dialectic tension.
So the essay explores how chance events interact with rigid causal chains and larger patterns of order or destiny in the universe.
Chance acts as a necessary counterconcept that prevents absolute determinism. It forces the philosopher, or the theologian, or the scientist to define the absolute limits of their certainties.
So if fate is absolute, then the appearance of chance must be an illusion.
And if chance is real, then fate, as a rigid, predetermined path, cannot be absolute. They exist in mutual tension.
So let's explore that tension through the three crucial cross-references listed in the essay, Providence, Freedom, and Nature, starting with the profound implications for theology. How does the reality of randomness fit into the idea of divine governance, or a predetermined plan?
Providence. This is one of the oldest theological wrestling matches in Western history.
It seems like a direct conflict.
It does. If chance exists, if truly uncaused accidental events occur, like a random natural disaster striking a pious community, does that not fundamentally challenge the idea of an absolute, meticulous providence?
How can an omnipotent, benevolent God orchestrate every detail if randomness is structurally permitted? If a catastrophe is truly random and accidental, it's difficult to reconcile that with the idea that every detail is part of a perfect, divine plan.
Unless the definition of plan is broadened enormously.
Right.
It demands a subtle theological compromise. Thinkers, particularly during the medieval period, developed concepts like secondary causality.
What's that?
They argue that God, as the primary cause, establishes the ultimate necessary laws of physics and nature. But within those laws, he grants a degree of independence, a secondary causality to created things.
Including natural processes and human will.
Exactly. So under secondary causality, the outcome of a coin flip is not specifically willed by God in that moment, but the fact that the coin can be flipped and the laws governing its motion are ordained by him.
I see. This allows for contingency. The coin landing on heads is a chance event, an intersection of forces not dictated by divine intervention, but by natural laws.
And this preserves order while permitting genuine randomness to operate. So Providence is absolute in its grand design and initial creation, but it permits contingency in its immediate moment-to-moment governance.
And the opposing view.
The opposing view, that Providence is so absolute that nothing is truly accidental, means, again, that chance is just reduced to a term for human ignorance, a necessary cover for the hidden divine mechanism.
It's incredible that a concept as simple as the accident forces theologians to define the very scope of God's interaction with the universe.
And this complexity immediately feeds into the stakes for human life and responsibility. Let's move to freedom.
Right. How do these philosophical debates about randomness affect our views of free will and moral responsibility? This is maybe the most practical and immediate cross-reference for all of us.
It is.
If everything is necessary, if the physical laws dictate every thought, emotion, and action, then the idea of true free will, a self-caused decision, it just vanishes.
My choice to drink coffee this morning was merely the necessary effect of an entire chain of prior causes stretching back forever.
And that's where chance becomes the escape hatch from absolute determinism.
It is. If chance is real, it introduces an element of contingency into the process of action and decision-making. For some philosophical schools, the existence of chance is vital because it provides the opening for truly self-caused, non-determined decisions.
It means that when you're presented with two options, the physical reality does not necessitate one over the other.
Correct. But isn't saying chance is merely ignorance a little arrogant, especially when considering free will? Philosophy has repeatedly shown that you can't just gather more data to solve the problem of choice.
And if my action is determined, the moral stakes collapse. The law can't hold me responsible for an inevitable result.
That is the ultimate ethical challenge of determinism, and it's why chance is so often seen as the defender of freedom. But the debate is deeply nuanced.
How so?
Because if chance is involved in decision-making, it can also diminish our agency. Think about it. We want our choices to be free, but we also want them to be rational and intentional, reflecting our values.
Not just random.
Not just random. If a decision is truly random, caused by a momentary, uncaused quantum fluctuation in the brain, for instance, is that a free choice or just an arbitrary event happening to you?
That's a crucial distinction. We want free will to be the opposite of determinism, which is where chance helps break the chain. But we also want our freedom to be rational, not random.
Which means chance must be integrated in a way that allows for self-direction, not just pure arbitrariness. The philosophical struggle is defining a rational freedom that isn't necessary, but also isn't purely accidental.
The cross-references in the essay really force you to confront this tension.
They do. A deterministic worldview sacrifices chance and often sacrifices freedom, viewing both as illusions. A worldview that insists on robust freedom has to find a way to incorporate true contingency, real chance, into the fabric of reality.
Usually placing that contingency within the mysterious operations of the mind itself.
That's right.
Finally, let's look at nature. We touched on the shift from Aristotle to quantum theory, but how does the discussion of chance fundamentally redefine the structure of the natural world in practical terms for science?
This brings us back to the methodologies of science itself. The entire mission of classical mechanics, championed by Newton, was based on the premise that nature is perfectly orderly and necessary.
The dream of determinism.
That was the dream. If we could know the position and momentum of every particle at one moment, we could predict the future of the entire universe. In this view, nature is fundamentally a machine, and chance is external, a deviation, an exception that proves the rule.
Which is why the acceptance of chance in modern physics was so revolutionary. It wasn't just a technical adjustment, it was a metaphysical crisis.
Exactly. The integration of chance into modern physics changes the foundational view of nature itself. It implies that nature is not merely complex, it has a kind of structural openness.
It's fundamentally random at some level.
It is. This doesn't mean the world is chaotic. It just means the world is governed by laws of probability, not laws of strict certainty.
So Adler's framework forces us to realize that our definition of nature is intrinsically linked to our acceptance or rejection of chance.
If nature is fundamentally orderly, our scientific mission is one of discovery, finding the necessary law that explains the apparent accident.
But if nature incorporates inherent randomness, our scientific mission is one of modeling and measuring the structural uncertainty.
And the Syntopicon's treatment of chance compels us to recognize that this seemingly simple concept, a random event, is the intellectual hinge point for understanding everything from divine authority and the limits of scientific knowledge to human responsibility.
It determines the limits of what we can know, predict, and ultimately what we can control.
It redefines the very word knowledge. If the world is necessary, knowledge is about certainty.
If the world is contingent, knowledge becomes about probability and statistical likelihood.
And this deep dive into the concept of chance, guided by Adler's framework, has taken us across the entire history of Western intellectual achievement.
We started with the foundational placement of chance in Adler's work, realizing it's not simply luck or a statistical phenomenon, but the concept that forces Western thought to define the edges of order, causation, and human liberty.
It is the necessary counterpoint to necessity.
We saw how Aristotle established the fundamental dichotomy between necessary events, for the most part, and accidental events by chance, which really set the stage for centuries of debate.
A debate over whether chance is a fundamental reality or merely a label for a profound ignorance.
We then traced its radical evolution through the modern era, where it became mathematically modeled through probability, transforming it from a qualitative concept to a rigorous, quantifiable one.
Which led directly to its eventual institutionalization in scientific theory, through concepts like quantum randomness, challenging the core assumption of a purely deterministic universe.
And finally, we detailed the profound implications of this great idea, linking chance inextricably to providence, freedom, and nature.
Illustrating that your stance on chance fundamentally dictates your view on ultimate cosmic order and the extent of human agency.
So for you, the learner, the final takeaway is this. Understanding chance, according to Adler, is essential for defining the limits of what we can know, predict, and control in life.
It tells us precisely where the predictable necessary world ends and where the contingent accidental world begins. It is the concept that forces humility upon our rational systems.
This leaves us with a provocative final question for you to consider, one that builds on this synthesis of ancient and modern thought.
If modern science models chance mathematically using rigorous probability theory, if we can calculate randomness with precision, as we do in quantum physics, does that mathematical predictability inherently make the random events less accidental and more necessary?
Has the realm of necessity simply expanded to include the reliable prediction of the unpredictable?
Effectively bringing the ancient debate over chance as ignorance versus chance as reality full circle.
That paradox, the certainty of uncertainty, is the intellectual challenge we leave you with.
For those who want to review the full philosophical argument in detail, there are several ways to engage further.
Click the link on screen for the in-depth essay summary. Subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think rationally.
See the many genre-based essay podcasts at Mindful Moments. Nourish your mind on the go.